Welcome back to the Aubergine Chef. Now today we'll be making a birthday cake for one of my friends down at the doggy daycare where my dog goes. And she wants a chocolate cake with chocolate icing, and she wants to have a pink fondant with a chocolate decoration. So I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to use the same recipes I've been using for a while. I'm going to use my Devil's Food chocolate cake for the cake, and I'm going to use chocolate Swiss buttercream for the icing. And then I'll show you how to pipe on the decorations. I'm also going to make some flowers out of chocolate fondant or chocolate gum paste, whichever you have, or modeling chocolate. I have chocolate fondant, so it's going to take a little bit longer to dry. So when you make them, or I've already actually made them about a week ago, so they had lots of time to dry because chocolate fondant takes a long time to dry. So give them a good week for them to dry. And especially if you live in a humid atmosphere, it's just going to take that much longer for them to dry out. So anyway, why don't we go ahead and get started. So for the Devil's Food chocolate cake, I have, let's see, well actually I'm going to double the recipe for the Devil's Food chocolate cake on my website. I don't have it on the website doubled out, but it's pretty easy to double out yourself, and I'm going to give you the measurements as I go along. I'm doubling the 2 9-inch cakes 2-inch deep recipe, so that way it gets us 4 9-inch cakes. But what we really need is 1 10 by 3-inch round and 2 6 by 2-inch rounds. And so I'm actually going to trim this down because I need 6 by 3. So that way we have a 10 by 3 and a 6 by 3 cake when we are ready to stack them, get them all ready to go. So anyway, I'm using one of my biggest bowls for this recipe because we do have to fold the egg whites in at the end, and it's just easier if you have a bigger bowl than a really tiny bowl, and then you have it batter spilling all over the place. It's just something I've learned over time, especially with this recipe because I make it a lot. So anyway, in this bowl we have 1 pound 7 ounces of all-purpose flour, 3 ounces of unsweetened cocoa powder, a half an ounce of baking soda, a half an ounce of salt. And that's it, and half an ounce of salt. So anyway, then I sifted all those ingredients together, especially the cocoa powder and the baking soda, because those have a tendency, especially the cocoa powder, have a tendency to clump up, especially when it's humid, especially. Anyway, so you want to make sure that you sift it, because you don't want to have chunks of cocoa powder sitting in your batter, because they won't be absorbed, and when you slice your cake, you're going to have chunks of cocoa powder in there. So you want to make sure you sift them, and so that everything is nice and even and powdery. And make sure you stir it together with a whisk or a wooden spoon or something like that, so that way there's not just cocoa powder sitting on top of flour, sitting on top of baking soda, that kind of thing. So what you also want to have is you want to have 6 eggs separated. Now, usually I show you how to separate eggs, but I forgot. I went ahead and just did it. But we are making buttercream, which requires eggs to be separated, so I'll show you later in the video how to do that. So we need 6 egg yolks and 6 egg whites separated. And because we're making a meringue, you want to make sure to prepare your mixing bowl and all that stuff. So like, for example, I weighed out my egg whites in this green bowl, or a separate green bowl actually, and this bowl, the mixer bowl, and the whip, I wiped them all with a damp paper towel dampened with vinegar. And what that does is it helps break up any fat residue that may still be on the bowl. I mean, sometimes it just happens. And the reason you want to do that is because any fat residue, even from the yolks especially, they will inhibit the way the egg whites will whip up. So it's just an extra precaution to wipe everything off with vinegar for your meringue. You also want to have 1 pound 5 ounces of cold water, or room temperature water, whichever, just not hot. And you want to have 2 separate bowls. You want to have 10 ounces of granulated sugar, and you want to have 13 ounces of granulated sugar. The 13 ounces is going to go mixed in with our 8 ounces of shortening. I have 8 ounces of shortening here. I like to use the butter-flavored shortening. And the 10 ounces is going to be used in the beginning to make our egg white meringue. You also want to have a little vanilla extract sitting ready, so that way we can add it when we are mixing in or creaming together the shortening and the sugar. So why don't we go ahead and get started? All right. So to make the meringue, what you need to do is you need to put your egg whites in your bowl that was wiped out with a little bit of vinegar, and start whipping it up. When it gets frothy, we are going to slowly add in the granulated sugar. Let's go ahead and add in our sugar slowly. Alright, looks like we're at medium to stiff peak, so we're going to go ahead and take this off the mixer. I'm going to take the egg whites, put them in a separate bowl, and then put my 8 ounces of shortening into this bowl. Alright, so I have my 8 ounces of shortening, along with my 13 ounces of granulated sugar, and about 1/4 ounce of vanilla extract. And what we're going to do is we're going to cream them together, so we need to switch to the paddle attachment. And we're going to cream them together until they're light and fluffy. And you don't have to wipe your bowl out first when it has the with the egg white still in it, because it won't affect anything. So it's just an easy way to skip a step. Because if you whipped everything else up first and then you made the egg whites, you would have to wash your bowl out. So it'd be an extra step added in. Okay, once everything's nice, light, and airy, we can go ahead and add in our egg yolks. So we're going to add them in one at a time. Okay, we'll go ahead on a low speed. Add them in one at a time until they're all incorporated. We don't have to wait until they're completely absorbed by the shortening to continue adding the egg yolks. We can just add them in a steady stream one at a time. Not a stream, but allow it some time to be absorbed, but you don't have to wait until it's completely gone. And then add in about a third to a half of your dry ingredients. So where this is the flour, the cocoa powder, the salt, and the baking soda. Alright, and just before it's all incorporated, we're going to go ahead and add in about half of our water. Okay, and before the water is completely incorporated, we'll go ahead and add in our remaining cocoa powder and then our remaining water. Okay, so once your batter is smooth and pretty much lump-free, we are going to go ahead and fold in our egg whites. So put your batter into a nice large mixing bowl, and then add in about a third or a quarter of your egg white meringue we made earlier. Now what we're doing is we're lightening the batter because we want the egg white meringue to retain as many of the air cells as we whipped into it in the beginning. And when you fold in a meringue into a really heavy substance or really heavy batter, it ends up destroying most of the air cells. So the lighter we can make it, the fewer air cells that are destroyed, which means more leavening and a lighter product. So we do this by sacrificing some of the egg whites to lighten it. Then go ahead and add in another third or another quarter. Okay, so once our batter is mixed together, we're going to go ahead and put it into our prepared cake pans. I sprayed them with some pan release and put a little square parchment paper in the middle. You don't have to use a whole circle. It's just as long as it doesn't stick in the middle, it shouldn't stick anywhere else. And plus you can run a knife along the sides if it does stick to the sides. And then you just spray it again so the parchment paper is sprayed on top too. So we're going to take some of our batter, pour it into our cake pan. You don't have to use a tool to scoop it in. I'm just doing that because the bowl is just so big and heavy. And you want to fill it up about halfway to 3/4, maybe 2/3, something like that. Somewhere in that ballpark. You don't want to fill it all the way to the top because your batter will just spill out. Alright, so once your cake batter is poured into your cake pans, make it pretty smooth. You don't have to make it perfectly smooth. And then we're going to go ahead and bake this in the oven at 350 degrees for about 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the cake layer. The small ones should be ready pretty soon. And what we're going to do is we're going to test them. Just insert a knife or a toothpick into the center of the cake, pull it out. If it comes out clean, there's no batter clinging to it or anything like that, then they're ready to come out. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and show you how I made the chocolate flowers. They're just very basic, no wire or wireless flour, sorry. And I kind of made them using the same kind of method that I would use to make dogwoods or daisies or something very simple like that. Buttercups. So what I'm going to do is this is a vinyl placemat, pretty cheap, and I put on a thin layer of plain Crisco or plain shortening. And here I have a small piece of chocolate fondant that I kneaded with a little bit of shortening to kind of make it nice and smooth. And if you want, if you have issues with your chocolate fondant or you are concerned that your chocolate fondant won't dry in time, you can knead in a little tylose powder Tylose powder is something that you add to fondant to make it into gum paste. It helps dry it out more quickly and more delicately. So once you have it kneaded, go ahead and roll out your chocolate fondant. And this is pretty much the same procedure for gum paste too. So, oops. Actually, it's pretty thin. So I'm going to go ahead and just use it like this. And then, once you have it rolled out, I'm using a leaf cutter for this. And I cut out a bunch of petals, at least 5 for one flower. If you do a big chunk of chocolate fondant, you can cut out a bunch of them at the same time so you can save a little time that way. And then you want to put your chocolate fondant away. Now normally, while you are not handling a certain piece of fondant, like if you're putting this away and you're not handling these, you want to cover it with a plastic bag, and vice versa. If you're working with these and you have a chunk of fondant that you're going to be saving for later, you either want to put it away or put it in a plastic bag. But because chocolate fondant takes forever to dry out, I'm not really that concerned. So the next step is we're going to vein our petals. And the petal is going to go outward like this. The point that's actually the bottom of the leaf is actually going to be the top of the petal. And so I'm taking a tool, the boning tool, and I'm just going to draw like 5 or 7 veins along the petal. It's a little bit easier if you're a little bit lower, like if you had a stool. And then on your, this is a fruit crate. It's like an apple or peach or crate like that. And you want to take your petal. It's dusted with cocoa powder. If you're working with a light colored fondant, you want to use powdered sugar. And just place it like that in the middle. And then you just do it again with the remaining petals. So you need 4 more petals. Okay, so once you have all of your petals put onto your flower, you should look somewhat like a star shape like this. Push down in the middle to kind of press them all together. And then we need to make the middle. So for my middle, I have a flower mold for the center of the flower. And I like to use like the smaller ones. And so I'll just push in a pea-size amount of chocolate fondant to get a nice texture to it. And then I just push it right into the middle of the flower. So it's a very simple, basic flower. You can use this for gum paste as well. Now normally, when you do gum paste flowers, you have something called gum paste glue, which is gum paste gums with a little bit of water, very little bit of water. And it helps secure your flowers together, or your petals together. It's not really necessary with fondant or sometimes even fresh gum paste because sometimes it just sticks to itself. But chocolate fondant especially, it's just really sticky. So I didn't have any reason to use it. And then after about a week, your chocolate fondant will be nice and dry and you can pick it up like that. It helps give it a cup shape. That's why we put it into the apple crate. Now, if you're doing gum paste flowers, one thing to know is it doesn't take as long as it takes for chocolate fondant dry. For your gum paste, all you have to do is give it 1 or 2 days, and it should be perfectly fine. To store it, you can either put it loosely covered in a plastic bag, but if you're afraid of like flies or dust getting on it, you can cover it with paper towel. You just want it to be able to breathe. You don't want to completely put it entirely in a plastic bag because then you're not allowing it to dry out and be exposed to the dry air. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and make our buttercream. Now the cakes have come out of the oven and they're cooled off. I took them out of the pans already, but I'll show you the technique that I used to get them out of the pans. I'm also going to show you how to separate an egg. I've already separated 11 eggs. We need 12 eggs altogether. So crack your egg open. And remember that this bowl and the whip attachment were wiped off with a little bit of vinegar. Drop in your egg, if it's going to open. And I'm using a small separate bowl to weigh, or not to weigh, but to separate the egg white first because there's so many eggs that I don't want it to be ruined if I get a bloody egg or something's wrong with the egg, or if I break the egg, because we're making a meringue, so we want them to be separated very cleanly. And I'm keeping the egg yolks. Normally I throw them away, But this time there's actually enough egg yolks that I'm using that I can make ice cream later. So I'm going to reuse the egg yolks to make ice cream. So that way I'm not wasting too much product. And I needed 10 egg yolks to make my ice cream. It's a saffron ice cream recipe. It's also on my website. And all these recipes are on my website, www.theauberginechef.com. Then I'm just going to pour the egg whites into a metal bowl. And luckily that the mixer bowl is big enough to warm over the stove on a double boiler. So we'll go ahead and go over there and do that. Alright, so once your water comes to a boil, go ahead and lower it down to simmer, something much less hot, so that way you don't end up accidentally cooking your eggs. And what you want to do is you want to cook your 12 egg whites with 15 ounces of granulated sugar until it reaches 120 degrees. Now, if you can go above 120 degrees, that's great too, because that means your egg whites will be that much stronger. But just be careful that your egg whites don't accidentally start to cook and turn into scrambled eggs. You want to gently stir it so that way no egg whites are getting heated up unevenly. So the temperature is getting heated up evenly throughout the egg whites, and so that way you can stir in the melted sugar as it gets melted. Okay, so once your egg whites reach 120 degrees or higher, go ahead and put it on your mixer and whip them up to medium to stiff peaks. Okay, so once your icing comes together, and what I mean is sometimes when you're whipping it up after you've added the butter, it kind of looks like curdled cheese or scrambled eggs, something like that. That's okay. Just keep pushing through it. It'll come together and form that nice velvety sheen, that very smooth look. So next we're going to add 10.5 ounces of sifted powdered sugar. This is going to help with the consistency, the sweetness, and it's going to make it a little bit stronger as well. Go ahead and mix it in slowly. Okay, so once your powdered sugar has been mixed in, scrape down the sides of your bowl. And then next, we're going to add in our cocoa powder. Now I've got 4 tablespoons of sifted cocoa powder. We should be able to add up to 9, but you always want to add a little bit at a time because you can always add more, but you can never take anything away. So we're just going to add in the 4 tablespoons of sifted cocoa powder. Very important to sift it so that we don't have any chunks of cocoa powder making your icing all lumpy. And we're going to mix it, and then we're going to taste it. And if it tastes strongly of chocolate and where we want it to be, then we can stop. Otherwise, we can add in another tablespoon or 2. Okay, so I added in a total of 8 tablespoons of cocoa powder. You may need to add more. You may need to even add more than 9, depending on the flavor you're looking for. Just be careful not to add so much cocoa powder that you end up turning your icing more into a paste. You don't want to turn it all, because the cocoa powder does have that drying effect, and you don't want to turn it into that paste, because then it won't be any good to dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape down the sides of my bowl, whip it up again, and then I'm going to put it in the refrigerator for about 10-15 minutes or so, let it set up so that way it gets nice and firm before we ice with it. And while it's doing that, we'll be cutting our cakes. Okay, so as you can see, I've already taken my cakes out of the cake pans, but I'll show you how a good technique for getting them out. So once you've run your knife along the side of the cake, and you remember you have that parchment paper on the bottom, all you have to do is take a cardboard or the wire cooling rack, put it on top, then flip the whole thing upside down, and the cake should more or less pop out. Whoops, more or less pop out. If it doesn't, give it a good whack against the table, just slam it real hard, and it should pop out. Alright, so to cut our cakes, I have on my turntable just a damp paper towel that holds the cake in place while I'm turning it. And what we're going to do is trim off the top layer, and then we're going to cut it in half. So look for the lowest point of your cake on the top, and then just draw a line along the edge of the cake. Then kind of slowly start sawing into that line. Whoops. Then once you have the indentation, go ahead and just start sawing into your cake. Keep your knife level. Remember that sometimes for stiffer cakes, your knife will want to naturally draw upward. So to counter that, you kind of want to point your knife slightly downward. Don't don't turn it so much downward that you end up cutting a cone into your cake. But if you don't put that downward force on it, sometimes you'll create a domed cake layer, and you'll have to go back and cut it again. So just slightly angle it downward. Okay, and then once you've cut all the way through, your cake layer should come right off. Now you can save your cake layer for cake balls or for snacking on for later. It freezes really well, so you can even save it for when the next day you do bread pudding. I have so much cake in my freezer from all these scraps that I have yet to use that I'm just going to throw it out. I know it's terrible, it's a total waste of good cake, but I've got like at least 3 cakes worth of cake in there. So I'm going to just go ahead and skip it this time. But definitely save it for snacking, for cake balls, for bread pudding, whatever, and use it that way. So once you have a nice level cake, we want to go ahead and split the taller cake in half. Now if you have several smaller cakes, like my 2-inch cakes, and you probably don't need to cut off so much or separate them because they just naturally form their own layers. But if you have a 3-inch cake or taller, you might want to go ahead and slice it. You don't have to, it's up to you, but I'm going to cut it in half and then fill it with more icing. Okay, so when you're ready to ice your cake, go ahead and prepare your workstation. Make sure it's very clean, no crumbs anywhere. I had a chef that always said if there was a single crumb on the table, it will wind up on your cake. So the fewer crumbs you have on the table, the better off you are. That will keep the cakes out of your icing. Now we are covering this with fondant, so it's not a huge deal if we get crumbs in our icing because it will be covered up by the fondant, but it's always a good habit to practice. Also, we are going to use something called simple syrup to add moisture to our cake. It's 1 part water, 1 part sugar with a little bit of cream and tartar brought to a boil, and you just cool it off, of course, because you don't want to use hot syrup because you're just going to make your cake hot. Just pour it onto your cake, and this will add moisture and sweetness to your cake. This isn't necessary. If you don't want to do it, you can skip it. But you can also add flavor this way. You can also put like liquors or extracts into the simple syrup to add extra flavor into your cake. So once the simple syrup is absorbed into your cake, we can go ahead and start icing. We want to put our first layer, which is going to be the middle. So this is the bottom layer. Remember, this is our cold icing that we took out of the refrigerator. We whipped it up slightly just to get rid of any chunks, so that way it's nice and even again. But we don't want to whip it to the point where it warms it up again, because we want it to be nice and cold. I've also cooled off turned on my air conditioning, so that way it's nice and cold in here. Okay, so just push your icing to the edge, make it nice and even. Doesn't have to be perfect since this is going to be the inside layer. And you almost kind of want it hanging off the edge as well, so that way when it squishes down, the cake will squish out icing onto the side. So that way you know it's all the way to the edge. Then we're going to take our top layer and put it on top of the cake. A little bit off, so I'm going to try and push it over. Okay, go ahead and put simple syrup on your top layer as well. And then we're going to go ahead and ice the top. Go ahead and start off the same way. Go ahead and push the icing to the edge of the cake. Then what you want to do is while turning your turntable, you want to smooth out your icing, trying not to create that little dip in the middle like I did. I was holding it too much at an angle. You kind of want to hold it upward a little bit. Okay, we'll go back and fix the top. I'm going to go ahead and ice the sides. So what I'm doing, let's see if I can get it, is I'm pushing the icing. I'm pushing the icing onto the side like this. I'm reaching over the cake so that way it's a little bit easier. And I'm using the cake cardboard as a guide because it sticks out a little bit from the cake, so that way I know about how thick the icing is going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that. Okay, so to get my sides nice and smooth, I'm going to use a bench scraper. Lower you down a little bit. And using the cake cardboard as a guide again, I'm going to go ahead and hold my bench scraper steady and against the cake cardboard without leaning into it. Try and create a nice smooth layer of icing. Remember, the smoother your icing is, the smoother your fondant will end up being. Okay, I'm going to go back and finish the sides, but first I'm going to finish the top. So that ring has formed around the edge of the on the edge of the top of the cake because of finishing the sides. So all you have to do is just kind of just pull it towards the center. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how smooth my top of my cake is. So I'm going to go back and try and clean up the sides a little bit. Wherever I see rough sides, or rough edges, I'm going to go ahead and try and re-smooth it down. So that way when the fondant gets put on, it'll look nice and smooth. The smoother your icing is, the smoother your fondant will be. Okay, and that's pretty much it for icing the cake. I'm going to go ahead and continue smoothing out any rough edges. I'm going to ice the smaller tier, and then when you come back, we'll be going to put the fondant on the top of the cake. Also, before I go, you want to make sure to refrigerate your cake for about an hour or two so the icing sets up, so that way it doesn't interfere with putting on the fondant, because otherwise you'll just have really squishy icing on your cake, and while you're trying to flatten out your fondant, you're just going to have lots of just messes. Okay, so our cake has been in the refrigerator for a couple of hours, so the icing is nice and firm, and we can go ahead and roll our fondant. And so the lady ordering the cake wants pink fondant, so we'll be using pink fondant. And for the 10 by 3 inch layer, we will need 24 ounces, I've already weighed this out, 24 ounces of fondant, and we're going to roll it out to about 18 inches. Make sure you lightly grease your workstation with fondant, or if you prefer, use powdered sugar, whichever. I prefer shortening because it keeps everything nice and moist, and powdered sugar tends to dry stuff out. But shortening can make things greasy, and it can make your fondant nice and, not nice and soft, but very soft, to the point where it won't set up if you use too much shortening. So just keep that in mind. Okay, once we're right about where we want to be, go ahead and roll it up on your rolling pin. And we'll bring our cake over here. Okay, make sure, if you haven't already, transfer your cake onto the board that you want to use for presentation. You don't have to, you can move it after the fact, but I just think it's easier that way if you just go ahead and use it. And let's go ahead and roll our fondant on top. Okay. So go ahead and flatten it out if it isn't already flat against the top. So you want to smooth the top out first and then work your way down to the sides. Make sure you skirt your fondant by pulling it out slightly. All right, so once you've finished skirting out and pressing down your fondant, you're kind of stretching it out. What you're doing is you're pulling up on the fondant. Let me see if you guys can see what I'm doing. Yeah. You guys can pull up on the fondant and then try to push it in that way. You're not necessarily stretching it and pulling it because you can tear it. You're kind of just like trying to lay it flat against the cake and then skirt it down, stretch it out by pressing on it, pushing it down, so that way it's a very subtle pushing and very subtle stretching. So that way it's not like you're pulling it like elastic. You're kind of almost like forming it to the shape of the cake, so that way it's a little bit more gentle. It's kind of hard to explain, but once you do it, practice on some dummy cakes. Speaking of dummy cakes, there's another good fondant episode that I have. It's the Covering a Dummy Cake in Fondant episode on my website, www.theauberginechef.com. And once you've got it to the point where it's flat against the cake, you can keep moving around. Now, circles, I think, are a little bit easier than squares because they don't have corners. But at the same time, think of it as a steak, like a wooden steak, not like a meat steak. So that way it's actually like pushing up on your fondant to pierce it. So the smaller you go, like our 6-inch cake or even a 4-inch cake, it's going to act more and more like a piercing steak. So you're going to want to work a little bit faster each smaller you go. As you go wider, it kind of stretches out so that the edge along the top of the cake doesn't put so much pressure on the fondant. So once you've finished getting that, make sure you're nice and flat against the edge of the cake, and using your pastry wheel, pizza wheel, cut a nice smooth seam around the edge of the cake. All right, take off your fondant, and that's pretty much it. Now, we can reuse this fondant if we want, which I'm going to, of course, because I don't want to waste fondant. And I'll use it on the second layer. For the smaller layer, the 6 by 3-inch layer, we need about 14 ounces of fondant. So when you roll out your fondant, make sure that it can cover the edges of your cake and the top of your cake. So remember, this is 10 by 3, so 16, and then I threw in a couple inches in for good measure. So what did I say, 18 inches? So that way it can cover it and give us a lot of extra room to play around with. Now, if you didn't see on this side probably because it was covering from the cake from the camera, but it was pretty close. It was, just barely enough for me to use to cover the cake. So 18 inches is pretty much where you want to be size-wise when it comes to your cake. So I'm going to go ahead and cover the 6-inch cake, and when we come back, we'll stack and decorate them. And don't worry if the edge of your cake or the bottom of your cake isn't perfect looking. We're going to pipe a little border on it. It's not going to be enough to cover a lot of it, but it's going to be enough to make it look a little bit more clean, or a little cleaner. And if you can notice, the fondant is taking the shape of the cake. There's some air bubbles too, I'm noticing that now, and especially on this side. But mostly you can see that because the cake was pretty smooth, but this fondant is still going to mimic any imperfections in the cake whatsoever, which is why it's not exactly perfectly smooth. And I'm not really good at icing cakes, perfectly anyway, so I don't expect to have a perfectly smooth cake. But just keep that in mind when you are doing the fondant. The smoother you get your icing, the smoother your cake will be. Okay, so I have some dark chocolate, coating chocolate, that I'm going to use to pipe the decoration on the side. And this basically decoration is going to be what you see here, these little squiggles. Now, coating chocolate is different from real chocolate because it doesn't contain any cocoa butter, so we don't have to worry about tempering it. But if you're comfortable with tempering chocolate, or you have the time to temper chocolate, I would suggest try using regular chocolate. But anyway, coating chocolate is usually available in grocery stores. And so anyway, I melted it down in the microwave, and I'm basically just going to pipe these little squiggles like this. Something to that effect. But I'm also going to not only going to do it on the top, I'm also going to do it on the sides. So, to make things easy, I'm going to go ahead and decorate the sides of the small tier before stacking it. Now, I did get a little bit of a tear on the side, if you can see it. So I'm going to try and start somewhere along those lines when I do my first squiggle, so I can try and cover it up. Alright, so there's going to be a little bit of a dot border along the bottom, So I'm going to start up a little bit higher than where that border is going to be. I already started piping a line, so I'm going to just finish off where I started. And I'm just going to repeat this pattern until it covers the entire cake. And I'll show you guys a shot of that once I finish. Okay, so this is the 10-inch round. And I finished piping on it. And as you can see, it's not perfect. It's actually really, really difficult to pipe on the side of the cake. Every time I do it, I always forget. Because you got to hold your hand still, and you can't do the trick where you lift it up a little bit and let it fall down, because if you lift it up a little bit, it'll fall down. So you're going to have to just have a very steady hand. But the good news is we made all those chocolate flowers. We can cover up some of our oops areas. So one of the first things we need to do is figure out where is the back of the cake. And when I say that, we want to put the worst side to the back. Usually it's where you started. Also, you can see where I did the little pearl border. Pearl border is very simple. I'll show you how to do that when we stack the tiers, but it makes it very professional looking. I'd say this is probably some of the worst areas. I don't know. I mean, it's not all bad. There's some good spots and some bad spots. But we'll cover it up with flowers anyway. All right, so I'm going to show you a trick for stacking cakes. Now that we know our cake is somewhat about this big, so we can place it probably right about here. Ooh, that was kind of sticky. I guess it's sweating a little bit from the humidity. That's one thing to remember too, is if you live in a really humid atmosphere, or if it's summer or something like that, the humidity can cause your fondant to get sticky, and that may hinder your ability to pipe chocolate, royal icing, or anything on top of your fondant, so keep that in mind. Instead of using columns to stack cakes, what I like to use is straws. And I learned this in school, and I read this in a few cookbooks, and basically all you do is you insert the straw in as straight as possible. You don't want to use a bendy straw. All you need is 3 in a triangle shape. And then using a pair of very sharp scissors, cut it right to the surface. Okay, now with this in mind, we're going to stack our tiers right on top of those straws. Careful if there's any buttercream on the bottom of your cake, so that way it doesn't leak onto your tier. And oh, that's why it was sticking so much. Okay. Yes. Remember to take off your piece of paper that you used to make it so that way it wouldn't slide on the cardboard. I was having issues with it. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't slide my cake off my cardboard or my spatula very cleanly, and that would be why. That's a very good reason why. Okay. So now that we've got it stacked, it's a little off-center, but that's okay. First thing we're gonna do. Oh, maybe I should explain. I put it on a square board, if you can see that. And normally I would just keep it on this round board. It's just kind of a waste to put it on the square board, but it makes it look a little bit nicer, but it also will help with carrying it, because tiered cakes, they're a little bit tall, and I don't really have anything. Maybe my cupcake container might have been okay, but there's another way we can do that, and I'll show you what we're going to do for carrying it, especially if you can't deliver it and finish it there. So the pearl border, all you're really doing is squeezing and pulling as you go along. So just pipe a little dot and then pull it and do it over and over again. And that's all it really is. It's very simple. Okay, now that I've finished, I realized I should have told you, you want to start in the back and then work your way around. You don't want to start in the front, because because usually where your seam is, or where your pearls meet, or whatever, your shell border, if that's what you're doing, that's usually where your worst shell is. So you want to hide that by putting it in the back. But it's already done, so there's nothing we can do about it. Alright, so first thing is what we're going to do is, before we continue piping the curls, I'm going to go ahead and write happy 21st birthday Shayna along the sides of the cake. Okay, so after you type happy birthday, then you have a better idea of where you can finish putting on the curlicues. So I'm going to go ahead and finish putting the curlicues on the top of the cake. I'm going to go around the edge of the cake and on the top part, and then we'll put the flowers on. Okay, so now that we've got all of our curlicues painted on, or piped on, sorry, we can go ahead and put on the flowers. Now we're going to use the coating chocolate as a glue. So basically, you just pick a spot you want to put it on and stick it on. And when the coating chocolate sets up, it'll set up as well. Try to place your flowers on the cake so that way they cover up some of your mistakes. If you find that your flowers have a lot of cocoa powder in the back of it, just use a paintbrush and brush it off. Alright, so here's the finished cake with all the chocolate flowers on it. I ended up using almost all of my flowers actually, so don't feel like you have enough flowers when you get like a dozen. You really should have like 3 dozen flowers or even more than that. Always plan on using more flowers and not having enough. I don't know if I particularly like the rose spray on top or the flower spray on top. I wish I could have just turned it a little bit more like this, but otherwise I'm pretty happy with it. So I think that this one came out okay, and I think the birthday girl is going to like it. Alright, so that's the 2-tiered birthday cake. Now keep in mind that you need to put your straws spread out to a certain point so that way it hits all the points on the cake cardboard. And you really should have each of your cardboards as big as the cake, but a little bit more, so that way when you ice it, the cardboard's still supporting the icing. So that way it's not like if you don't have it stretched out a little bit further, like the cardboard a little bit hanging out further than the cake, then you have icing right up against the cake and it's a little bit too thin for, taste. But at the same time, you don't want to just like push it out without having any cardboard out, because otherwise it's going to fall and sink a little bit. So try to make it so that way your cardboard's a little bit bigger than the cake itself. And usually if you get like for example, a 6-inch cake and you have a 6-inch cardboard, sometimes the cake shrinks a little bit. So that way it gives you just enough space to work with. Now, you're probably wondering why I have the cardboard box here, or maybe you already figured it out. But basically, the cardboard box is 12 inches by 12 inches, as well as this gold square. So what we're going to do for shipping it, or for delivery, or however you want to call it, we're going to use, it just needs to be covered. It's not like it needs to be, sealed. And so that way, the gold board on the square protects the cake itself, so that way the panels don't actually, push inward or whatever, and the cake or the box will keep it from getting dust or bugs on it or whatever. And it's just enough so that way it can keep it from getting, stuff on it while it's in transit. Once you get to where you need to be, just take the box off. And there you go. So I hope you learned a lot today. Thanks for watching. And remember, the Aubergine Chef, demystifying dessert, one recipe at a time.